Okay, thank you once again, everyone, for joining today's webinar. You can see on the screen here, today's session is around business capability map. Also worth highlighting, on the screen here, you can see a QR code for the Enterprise Architecture Summit that we have coming up in June later this year. Again, we'll cover this in a bit more detail later on. So for today's specific session around business capability maps, it's presented by myself, Andrew Luthwaite. I'm the pre-sales lead here at Avolution. And really, these webinars are to give you a flavor of some of the topics that we'll be covering, of course, in this case, business capability maps, but not just from an aspect of going through sets of slides, but also we want to provide a bit more of a live demonstration of Abacus in action as well. Before we get to that, of course, we want to cover some of the topics around business capability maps. And of course, that will be in slide format, just to give you an idea of the types of content that we'll be covering today. So before we jump into some of the concepts around business capability maps, it's worth highlighting, of course, who we are for those of you who don't know who Avolution and Abacus are, and maybe just as a quick recap for those of you who do. So we are essentially an enterprise architecture tool vendor, and we produce a tool called Abacus. So Avolution, company name, and Abacus is the tool. And as I mentioned, I'm a pre-sales lead here at Avolution and have been here for just over 10 years now. And I've had the opportunity to work with many customers across the globe. And that really emphasizes the fact that we have all of these customers globally, but also then supported by our worldwide offices as well. For those of you who are joining from the UK, of course, will be based off our London office, but that of course extends to general support across areas like America, Singapore, and Australia as well. As an organization, we've been running for just over 22 years now, leading the way for enterprise architecture tools. And of course, that's evident in our capabilities and the analysis that Gartner and Forrester have produced in terms of producing leading EA tool, Magic Quadrants and Wave Reports. And hopefully you'll see that we're positioned as a leader in those quadrants as well. We also, as a tool, are relatively agnostic of frameworks. It's something that we will touch on today, of course. And agnostic in the sense that we support different types of frameworks and notations and reference models, but we also advocate trying to combine these together to build something that's, of course, much more bespoke to your organization and to the industry that you work in as well. So that's the sales slide for Avolution. But now we're going to jump into some of the content around business capability maps and how we're going to be using these within an enterprise architecture tool, which isn't always evident, I guess, from some of the work that I've been producing and helping customers with over the last 10 years. The idea that capabilities typically are sitting within this strategic layer within the organization. Most often when we think of EA, we tend to think of applications, technologies, infrastructure, potentially processes. But more and more so, capabilities are coming to the forefront of that EA team, not just from a pure customer perspective that we've seen, but also from some of the reference models, TOGAF and Archimate, for example, having the ability to produce business capability maps. That's, of course, clearly driven by the market demand for EAs. But really what we want to do is focus on using these capability maps to leverage and drive some of the goals and growths within an organization. And one of the first things that are going to be useful when we think of capability maps is essentially to build buy-in. So we're trying to understand what are the typical kind of core business advantages and functions within an organization and how those capabilities are supporting those different areas. We'll also be looking at providing a bit more visibility across the organization, so a common model that people can reference, and also, of course, connecting applications, processes, and technologies to those capabilities. In some cases, we can think of capabilities as really an encapsulation of those different areas and domains. The other key reason for capability mapping is also to identify opportunities. So this could be maturity of capabilities and processes. This could be used for calculating technical debt. So we'll touch on this a bit more later on. And it could also be used for linking to things like an application status so that we can understand the overall future roadmap for our capabilities. And finally, something that hopefully most organizations are doing is some sort of form of transformation journey. So these are roadmaps that are going to be useful to identify gaps potentially within our capability models. And of course, that's going to be useful to be supported by the different processes, applications, and technologies internally to drive new capabilities within that model. So the first thing we'll focus on is, of course, building buy-in and around how we can actually produce a bit more of a consensus across the organization and how we can actually drive some common language across different teams as well. Now, I'm well aware that trying to define a business capability on a call like this is potentially fraught with semantic issues, and potentially we'll get to some of those questions towards the end as well. But really what we're trying to do is understand that capabilities are essentially what the organization does. It's not how the organization does something. And I think that's probably a well-accepted definition or an overview of what capabilities are within a specific organization or within a specific domain as well. It essentially represents the ability for an organization or business to do something. So with that definition, when we start talking about what the organization has the capability of doing, we're not really specifying what technology is involved, who's involved, what processes and functions are required for that capability. We really are treating it as high level as we can maybe get from the logical perspective of what the organization can do. Later on, of course, we will look at how different processes and applications and functions support those capabilities, but really it's the what that we're concerned with right now. From that, there are different approaches of how we can actually build these capability maps and start identifying some kind of common understanding across the organization. And there are different ways or different approaches that we can take for building these capability maps. Quite often, we already have customers who have their own capability maps. So of course, importing those types of things into Abacus is relatively seamless. And other times we have organizations that maybe are new to the capability map world and need some best practices or recommendations. And typically, these are the four approaches that we've seen as being the most common. So the first is this top-down approach to capability modeling. This is really where we start looking at maybe identifying kind of the top 20, 30 high-level business capability models. And that's really focused purely from a top-down perspective, i.e. the strategic outcome that we want to build. So from a strategic perspective, when we're trying to understand business and financial plans, how these maybe resonate with specific executives, how different stakeholders are involved within this particular model, that's really the area that we're focusing on from that top-down approach. So this could be the main functions, what kind of goals and objectives and desired outcomes are we looking for, and how do those capabilities support that business overall? This is really the conversational approach to this top-down method, if you like, where we really are engaging with business stakeholders at that strategic level and trying to understand how they benefit the organization. The opposite to that is a bottom-up approach. So this is going to be focusing a bit more on the underlying processes, some of the applications and technologies that we have, and how do they provide value to the organization. This approach arguably is a bit more time consuming. Likely there's a bit more effort involved to collect that data initially and then build out that capability model. And sometimes it might not, let's say, accurately reflect what the organization is trying to achieve. So yes, we may have sets of technologies and applications internally, but we want to understand the strategic context as well. I would think both of these approaches are useful, but I would argue that there are slightly more best practices that will form rather than just using a top-down or bottom-up approach. And there are various ways that we can support that in Abacus as well. The next method is really more of an overview, I guess, of the types of models that already exist. So reusing approaches based off reference frameworks and reference architectures. So of course, top-down and bottom-up is arguably a bit more time intensive. You have to put a bit more effort into actually thinking about those capabilities, but we can use these reference frameworks as a baseline, essentially. There are some other kind of best practices that we might recommend here, whether that's using standard industry capability models or reference models. Again, I'll use the word capability relatively lightly here, but things like BIAN for the financial institutions or banking industry, essentially. We have things like BizBook. They both have a general capability model and industry-specific ones. And that's very similar to APQC's PCF models or process classification framework. Arguably, the terminology process classification framework gives you some indication of the differences here, how we're classifying capabilities. But either of these are going to be a good reference starting point for what you want to build out. I would argue trying not to reinvent the wheel through a capability map and reusing one of these reference models is a good place to start. You'll quite often find that when you start thinking of what capabilities you have internally, they're very often going to map to some of these reference architectures and reference frameworks. And of course, hopefully it goes without saying, but all of these are available out of the box with Abacus. You can deploy these on day one and really build a reference model and see maybe how closely you are aligned to those models as well. And that really encapsulates that final approach, which is the hybrid approach, which is start with one of those reference models, but make customizations on top of that. This is something we probably take as the most common approach for our customers. We want to try the hybrid approach to make sure that we can leverage existing data sets, but also build on that as well, because we're well aware that even though these reference architectures and frameworks exist, customers will already have unique things tailored to their organizations. So use a reference model, but make sure that you can tailor it to the model that you're actually trying to build internally. Now, the benefit of this, of course, using reference models and building a hybrid approach is really to provide visibility across the organization for that capability map view. And one of the reasons we want to do that is to drive into the lower level detail behind each of those capabilities that we've modeled. In this case, the idea being that we want to build some kind of relationship between that business and technology view. So these are essentially what we might call the dependencies between the layers. And often it's undertaken by the enterprise architects, but maybe not primarily. Likely we'll have other team members involved to build these relationships. And if we were to build a true, let's say, holistic enterprise architecture view, then really we're trying to build these connections across the model. That's the idea behind an EA tool. Primarily, it's to remove what typically was siloed pieces of information and allow these connections to be built across that model. A few ways this can be done. We can take a more kind of logical approach to import different data sets into Abacus, or we can build it out more organically and allow democratization of that data so users can actually enter this themselves and start building models from scratch, or using some of the templates in here as well. But providing visibility on that, of course, helps understand the functions, applications, and processes that might make up a specific capability. And then later on, we'll see how this can enforce some of the strategic decisions we make and identify some of the risks within the organization as well. One of the main ways that we'd recommend doing this is utilizing the ability for enterprise editors in Abacus to come into the tool and actually start making changes. In this case, process owners, application owners can jump into these application portfolios, and in this case, indicate which capabilities, so in this case, core capabilities, this application is actually supporting. And keep in mind, this could be done the other way around, capability owners coming in to indicate which applications are supporting those capabilities as well. But the idea is that we want to build this connected repository, and using these types of references and links becomes increasingly important as well. The other aspect of this, maybe from a process perspective, is to utilize the ability to connect those processes to the capabilities in a similar way that we might have done for the applications as well. This obviously supports some of the relationships that we're building in the model, and this can either be done through those list-based views as editor users, or through these diagram-based views as modeler users. It's Quite often within organizations, people are going to have preferences for how they want to build things. Lists are good for maintaining information. Typically, if we think of process modelers or solution architects, diagramming these components and connections is usually going to be the best way of modeling these types of situations. And then finally, we typically want to maybe automate these types of views by providing the ability to actually navigate through the content without having to actually draw something manually, but leveraging the graph database in Abacus to drill down through those data models. Again, we'll come in to see this in a bit more detail later on when we take a look at the live environment in Abacus. So the next stage from a capability map perspective is its use in identifying different opportunities internally. Now, of course, this does require some information behind the scenes. The connections and the dependencies allow visibility across the organization, but specific attributes or properties can then be helpful for identifying opportunities based off that capability model. One of those is to automate something like technical debt management within the architecture. So the capabilities in this case are really going to be a pivotal part of technical debt management. And that might not seem so obvious at the beginning. Usually when we start thinking about technical debt, there are different levels or approaches we can take. From a pure technical perspective, we may be thinking of the supportability of a code database, the lines of code within that particular program we're building. We might pull that up a level in terms of the different technologies that are being used as part of that code base. And typically, that can provide a really good tech debt score. And there are different ways that we can automate and build those algorithms and formulas, which you'll see in a few minutes as well. However, leaving it at that technology domain isn't usually that beneficial, but we usually want to build that up to the capability level. So do we need to prioritize specific processes and capabilities to address some of those technical debt scores that we've built up? How would we roll those tech debt scores up to the capability level and provide some kind of heat map effect? So if we have specific capabilities within the organization, we want to roll up those values from the applications that support those capabilities, and potentially that's being rolled up from the code base that application's written in. So within a specific domain, like the technology or code base domain, we still might want to roll that up to the capability level. We can usually do this at a much higher level as well, and have this as a simple heat map or scoring method on each of the capabilities. Well, that looks like from an Abacus perspective is essentially an algorithm that we can run against these capabilities that are passing those application tech debt scores up to that capability model perspective. So on the right-hand side, we're seeing what the algorithm looks like, collecting some applications, finding out what their tech debt score is, and then attributing that to the capabilities those applications are supporting. From an output perspective, it's then that heat map view on the left-hand side. So it's a great way then of focusing our attention, potentially in this case on brand management. The more highly orange color in here for brand management is indicating that it likely has a high tech debt score. Then the use case for that is looking at the applications behind the scenes, maybe moving things to cloud, rationalizing the application portfolio, or maybe some kind of cloud migration effort that's involved with the applications could also be run behind the scenes as well. Like I mentioned, of course, this requires data within the tool. There's a few things we can help with here. I've already mentioned interfacing Abacus to other solutions to import data sets, but you could be leveraging some of the machine learning and AI solutions in Abacus as well to actually help populate some of these data sets for you. If you have some blank values, you don't know what the tech debt score of an application is, we can provide some recommendations through those machine learning capabilities as well. Now, another good use case for why we'd actually build these capability maps is rationalizing applications. And again, hopefully this goes without saying, but this does require, of course, data behind the scenes for this as well. But really, one of the key things that we look at from an application perspective is two core properties, which we call the business fit and technical fit scores. So if we can rate or score our applications according to those scores, then it helps us make some kind of decision around those applications. But arguably, it's not enough information. I think what we typically want to do is to provide some context to see if we can provide a view where we have applications that are serving similar capabilities. And that allows us to make further strategic decisions on potentially which ones should be retired, or which ones can potentially be merged, or which potentially need to be focused elsewhere based on maybe a low tech fit score. So modeling those application portfolio views, connecting those to the capabilities, of course, is a similar approach to aggregating those properties up and down the model. The final aspect of a scoring perspective would be generally on the capability itself, based on something like a maturity score. There's a few different ways of doing this. Of course, we could use the algorithms once more in here, but CMI's approach to this is obviously quite useful as well. So we can kind of evaluate a process's maturity and typically aggregate that to the capability level. Again, it can be a bit of a challenge to get this information, but if we can start incorporating this into the rest of the organization, get the process owners to fill the information in, as we've already seen, then we can actually attribute this quite effectively across that capability model. There are some additional details that you might want to incorporate in here as well. So if process owners are filling in forms, if we're providing surveys for these capability owners or process owners, this is just another way that we can start gathering that content and that information and start pushing that into the algorithms that we have in Abacus as well. And then one of the final things that we wanted to cover is how we actually chart this transformation journey. And there's a few different ways of doing this in Abacus. But really what we're trying to leverage is the capabilities that we've modeled and identifying the opportunities, providing context around that, allows us to build some kind of roadmap. Now, roadmaps themselves probably have their own definition, and we've provided extensive webinars dedicated to just road mapping. But to give you some indication of what a particular dashboard might look like for a particular roadmap, what we're trying to do is understand the capabilities. So we have this current state view in the bottom left. The capabilities modeled at that top level have specific applications that support them. And then those applications have connections to either specific databases or infrastructure. And so one of the things that we can try and transform in this case is maybe the reliability of the processes and capabilities that we've modeled based on the overall availability of those applications or infrastructure. And heat mapping this allows us to build a transitional target state on the right-hand side that can highlight that overall benefit of, in this case, rationalizing applications, migrating applications to cloud, or potentially combining some of the different databases that we have so we can improve some of the availability scores. Again, what we're effectively trying to do here is drive some technology decisions to benefit the business. And that could initially have come from some of the initial business requirements that we have for improving the availability of the services that we offer. So capabilities can act as a hinge across the entire organization, where really any decision that gets made is effectively going to be impacting that capability. Also worth pointing out, earlier on, we tried to build a rough definition of what capabilities are and how they can be used. Within most organizations, the capabilities rarely change. The capability will likely stay the same. It's everything else around it that will change. So new technologies, processes, potential introduction of new business functions, capabilities could be made up of external sources or contracts that are being signed. There are many things that can make up a capability, but typically it's going to be relatively unique to the organization. Again, we might not get into too much of the discussion right now. There might be questions later on, but certainly the definition of capabilities and functions and processes will help align how you actually define these things and name these things in Abacus as well. And the final slide really is just to provide a very similar view to the one you're seeing now. Although I would say the current view is more of an architectural style view where we actually want to see the underlying elements that make up some kind of transformation within the architecture. For stakeholders, I would advocate more of a KPI approach, which is, yes, we have these underlying technology and application changes, but really what we're focusing on here are the outputs or the deliverables from those target states and current states. In this case, what we're highlighting is the general availability of the services and solutions we have is increasing after this particular project or program has run. Our overall maturity for the capabilities has moved from managed to optimizing. And in this case, there's a significant cost saving applied to this HR solution migration as well. And it's probably, again, maybe worth pointing out, this is an ideal state. It's very likely not a realistic state. Usually when we start looking at these dashboards, we're providing some kind of trade-off. So for example, our availability of the services we provide may increase, but our costs potentially will increase as well, especially if we're now moving to a cloud-based solution. There's hosting costs, there's servicing costs. So that trade-off may be worthwhile, improving customer availability and services, with the trade-off being that our costs are higher. And again, in most organizations, it's a case of choosing the KPI you're interested in and deciding which trade-off is potentially of benefit. What we now want to do is just to jump into Abacus to show you some of these in a more live environment. And the chances are, of course, you'll be seeing very similar content to what you've seen already through the visualizations. But I just want to highlight how these are going to be built and some of the benefits that you'll hopefully get for using something like Abacus to build these types of capability maps. So we've jumped into Abacus Enterprise here. And Abacus Enterprise is going to be the core environment where we can start building these different dashboards. So some of those you've already seen. And it's in here where we'll have those different types of users that we've mentioned as well. So we'll jump, first of all, into this business dashboard, just to give you some context around the information we've seen so far. And this business dashboard is primarily focused on some of those capabilities that we've talked about. In this case, across the top, we have 3 different types of capability maps. We have this diagram approach, we have this tree map approach, and we have this graph view approach. And this is one of the benefits of using a tool like Abacus Enterprise, is that every stakeholder is likely going to want their own specific view of the model. So again, as a recommendation, I typically wouldn't provide all 3 views on one dashboard, but hopefully as we navigate through these, you'll see some of the key benefits that these are going to have as well. At this point, it's also worth mentioning that we've talked about ability to visualize the information, giving users access to this and providing visibility. Hopefully that's exactly what Enterprise is doing. It's allowing anyone in the organization to have access to this model. Okay, so we have free unlimited read-only access to this, usually based off single sign-on, so we can provide a bit more of a tailored approach to whoever's signing in. But that read-only user will then have the ability to navigate through this entire model. So this particular capability model here, which we've talked about before, this is the one from APQC's process classification framework approach. This allows us to understand, and in this case, heat map these capabilities according to specific values, like the aggregated values or properties from the applications, maybe the capabilities maturity score, or in this case, maybe some overall recommendation for these capabilities as well. And the diagramming approach has a few benefits. Of course, as a modeler user in here, I can come in and actually add new capabilities. This is a live diagram that I can change the properties on. I can define my own capabilities or reuse existing capabilities. It really is an environment for me to start drawing something and start maybe experimenting with some of the components and connections that we have in the model. And again, there are many benefits to taking this manual-based way of building these models. Then we could arguably look at the automated way. So manually drawing diagrams, I think, is always going to be a key thing for most architects or solution architects or process owners. But sometimes we also want to automate that. And we can leverage these tree map views to actually build the visualization for us. So if we already have a capability map, let's say we've imported something from Visio, we've used a reference model, These tree maps allow us to be much more specific at the level we want to drill down into. So if we want to be more concerned around the specific operating capabilities and processes we have, and we want to see how do we actually manage customer service as a capability, we can see which processes make up that capability. And if we drill down further, we can then see which applications support that capability as well. In this case, for each of the applications in this view, we're really just applying a couple of key points, which is the size and color. Again, heat mapping things is going to be useful so we can understand which applications are we actually going to be retiring at some point soon. So likely some cost savings. And in this case, the size of the application is its cost. So I can clearly see the cost of this application is providing the significant value to the process. At this stage, from a capability map perspective, we also might just want to understand things like who uses these applications. So we might want to provide a bit more detail around that in this view. And of course, from an application rationalization perspective, do we really need this many applications supporting that capability? Clearly, we've decided that a couple of these can be retired. The chances are even more applications could be retired in here to provide a bit more of a seamless integration point. This is often an exercise that's undertaken through M&As, specifically if you have new systems that are being onboarded and yet you have the same capability. There's always likely going to be a case for rationalization at that point in time, and that's going to be incredibly useful for those application and capability owners. The benefit of enterprise, of course, in this case is it's going to be filterable and dynamic. So yes, we could provide static reports out of Abacus, PDF, Word documents, but enterprise is providing much more dynamic abilities to drill down through the model, filtering multiple portlets on here to then reflect the level that we're at within that particular tree map. So those are some of the key benefits of moving into something like Abacus Enterprise so that we can actually navigate around that capability model. Now we can take this a step further and we can actually start looking at a graph view. So graph views provide arguably another level of automated visualization, if you like, and it's utilizing the components and connections that we have in the model already. And there are a few key use cases for this. The first is to allow users to explore the model. So any user could come into this view and they want to understand what management support capabilities do we have, and how does maybe our managed IT capability get made up of specific processes, goals, data entities, and other elements that are going to be incorporated in here as well. So you can see that by drilling down into a capability, Abacus is going to show me all of the relationships it has to other parts of the organization. Now, keep in mind, this is all going to be tailored through the specific stencil or viewpoints that we set. I could be much more specific and say I'm only interested in the capabilities and their connections to applications, or I'm only interested in seeing maybe how these capabilities are related to infrastructure or data. In this case, we've got this solution viewpoint selected, so really just seeing everything within this organization. So really good for exploring some of these opportunities, more so useful for impact analysis. So let's say we have a managed enterprise information process. This particular process is connected to a number of different applications, and each of these applications are likely hosted somewhere on some infrastructure. So what we're effectively doing here is drilling down from the high-level capability model through to processes, applications, and then eventually infrastructure. This is a slice through the entire architecture. And the reason this is beneficial is depending on the context of the use case, I now know that if this server was potentially offline one day, this application isn't going to be available. And this application is required for this particular process that is supporting this capability. So we can start deriving some of those relationships and impacts across the organization based on the connections that have been built in the model. And again, Earlier on, I mentioned, yes, a lot of this requires information, and it could be manually entered, or it could be integrated to other systems through the APIs. But I also mentioned the machine learning capabilities for Abacus to suggest specific values, such as a capability's maturity or an application's recommendation. Abacus can also suggest connections. So Abacus can start suggesting which applications should be supporting this process, or potentially which technologies should an application require based on other applications that require similar technologies. So even if you feel like you don't have the data set, Abacus can start recommending some of those values. And again, I would typically focus on integrations first, but the machine learning and AI capabilities in here are just going to further enhance the data sets that you already have. So those business dashboards, of course, become really useful for understanding those models. And it's going to be a key aspect of actually what we want to build in here as well. Now, let's just take this a step further into the application portfolio view. So we mentioned that those capabilities are supported by specific applications. And earlier on, I mentioned that we could aggregate some of those scores from the applications up to the capability level. In this case, what we're essentially doing is calculating an overall business fit and technical fit score for the app, and then rolling that up to the capability level. One of the ways that we do that is by taking into consideration some of the application properties, such as how much is the application being used by the business? Is it highly critical? Is it connected to maybe highly critical processes or functions? And based on those values, we can provide that overall business fit score. This eventually might translate into the capability maturity score. If a maturity of a capability is dictated by its ability to be supported by available applications within the organization, it's supported by applications that are being used by highly critical processes, it's an application that's set to be invested in and has a significant number of users, then of course that's likely going to dictate a higher capability maturity score within the organization as well. So that's one of the ways that we can actually use those views to generate the application and capability map scores. From an overall holistic viewpoint, and how do we actually visualize that? A recommendation would be to map those capabilities against the applications and provide that business and technical fit score and also the recommendation for those applications on a single viewpoint. So if we were looking to develop and manage our products and services, we can see it's being supported by 4 applications. One that's currently going through some kind of technology refresh, one that's going to be something that we invest in, one that's going to be redesigned, and one that has yet to have some kind of strategic recommendation assigned to it. And again, in some cases, for managing customer service, we can see we're retiring an application over here, and arguably, we might want to retire a few more in here if we have a significant number of applications supporting a capability. We might not necessarily need that many. So it's about providing the right view with the right context for the right user that's going to be in Abacus Enterprise. And that's really the benefit of using these dashboards, is that we can build these top-down views and we can allow people to navigate and interact with these data sets across the entire model. Earlier on, I also showed some of the outputs from this, and we showed a KPI portlet dashboard. And again, this was the idea of building these trade-off dashboards. So again, incorporating some of the KPIs we're focusing on here and how we actually address some of the capabilities that we have. The other thing to keep in mind when we start thinking about KPIs and capabilities is quite often from a capability perspective, we're modeling things that we have the capability of achieving right now. And very often we're modeling capabilities that do not yet exist. So this is the usefulness of building these KPIs. If we're trying to improve the availability of the services that we have, we may need to introduce new capabilities for that. If we're trying to reduce costs, we may need to introduce new capabilities to drive those cost values going down. So again, capability models aren't just a reflection of what you currently can do, it's also a reflection, hopefully, of what you want to be doing in the future, and providing some kind of trade-off could be that target state that you're modeling. We're modeling a target state where we introduce new capabilities, and lo and behold, that's resulted in an overall cost reduction and an improvement in the services availability that we have. So consider that when we're building these dashboards. Again, Enterprise is going to be available to anyone who wants access to this, and you can have access to all the data sets I've shown today as well. But these dashboards are going to be a key part of building these visualizations and making use of those data sets. Finally, just as a quick recap, I just want to go through, of course, what we've discussed today, which was capability maps are going to be there to build buy-in as the first point of contact. So really visualizing those business capabilities and building something that's actually suitable to the organization. By providing visibility across those, what we're really talking about is connecting those to the processes, people, applications, and technologies across the organization. For most customers that I've worked with, applications and technologies are relatively easy to get hold of. Pushing into processes sometimes can be a bit more difficult. We don't necessarily need to design an entire process using BPMN. It's usually sufficient just to capture the top level. And usually that's a hierarchy of capabilities and processes. So they do tend to kind of fluctuate into each other in here, but really the hierarchy of capabilities and processes is then connected to the applications and technologies. Identifying opportunities, of course, is one of the main reasons for building these capability maps. What kind of use cases are we working on? What kind of analysis do we want to run? And how are we actually going to improve the organization's ability to deliver these capabilities? And finally, the transformation aspect of capability mapping, of course, is important as well. When we think of transformations and those current states and future states, I would arguably focus on a specific KPI or metric initially. There's no point building a future view if we don't really know where we want to go and what the outputs or deliverables are going to be for that particular future state or target state. So focus on a few KPIs. And the idea would be, of course, trying to achieve those through those target states. And target states could be multiple phases. There could be multiple project options to choose from. They're not arguably just one current state and future state. There's likely many different phases and approaches and branches to those, but really there's some kind of overall deliverable or outcome from those, whether it is a cost reduction or maybe in its simplest form, introducing new capabilities into the organization. So with all that in mind, I would highly encourage you to take a look further at some of the capability models that we provide out of the box. And if you already have your own, speak to one of the team here and we can provide some best practices on how that can be used to further enhance the model that you have. And what we want to do is move on to a Q&A. But just before we do that, we are just going to now open up a poll for some suggestions and recommendations for future webinars. The idea being that the enterprise architects and certainly general architects that we work with have specific priorities within their organization. And what we want to try and understand is where your priorities currently lie. There's a few reasons for this. First of all, we want to make sure that we can tailor these types of sessions in the future to more demand on specific areas. We want to make sure that we can provide some of those key capabilities in Abacus to address those priorities. And also it helps influence some of the decisions that we make around things like the webinars and summits that we have. So again, I mentioned at the beginning that we have the Enterprise Architecture Summit coming up this year in June. So if you want to sign up to that, please feel free to do so. You'll find the QR link here, and you'll also find more information on our website. But for some context, the summit is something we've been running now. I think this is probably the 6th summit we've run. So for 6 years now, we've been holding these virtual summits. It's free to attend, it's global, and it includes a few different sessions that hopefully are going to be beneficial to you. Not only can you gain some insights from EA leaders across the globe and connect with those peers directly, you'll also be able to engage in live panelist discussions. So we'll have breakout rooms for specific industries or use cases or topics, and you'll be part of one of the largest online EA conferences as well. The other key thing is this is a summit that's only made possible by our customers. They're contributing heavily to this summit. You'll hear how our customers are using Abacus, not just in terms of its benefits and its features, but on very specific use cases that they're working on. So not only will hopefully you'll see how Abacus can be used, you'll hopefully learn a bit about enterprise architecture deployment, use cases, and of course, topics like this around business capability modeling, AI, and I know there's a few other key things I've seen coming up recently, which we'll hold quiet on for now, but there's some quite cool, exciting webinars that I've heard of some customers presenting. So please feel free to sign up. You'll gain a lot more information on that closer to the time. And again, if you wanted to look back at the previous years that we've done, those recordings are also going to be made available as well. So we do have time for a few questions. So we'll take a look at the chat and the Q&A function in here, and we'll just go through anything that's currently come in. And that obviously can help them make obviously context to some of the questions that we have, and hopefully give you some insights into other areas that Abacus can be used. So let's just take a quick look. So there's a first question in here. Oh yeah, so we've got other, that's probably worth mentioning, we've got other platforms running. So you likely maybe will see questions from Avolution in here that are just picking some up from other chat functions that we have. But let's just start with a couple of these. So how can business capability maps relate to business modeling canvas? Sure. So the BMC model in Abacus, and also maybe just worth mentioning that the business modeling canvas notation in Abacus is one of those notations that's supported alongside things like the BMM model, business motivational model. So there's a few of these things out of the box that we can leverage. And one of the ideas is that you can start using these as an accelerator or a starting point within your organization. And there are different approaches, to using these things, of course. The business model on Canvas is probably a bit more of a strategic tool in this case. The idea being that you have these kind of, key elements, value proposition, customer infrastructure, boxes like this on that particular canvas. And really a capability model is more of a strategic tool, I guess, to summarize some of those capabilities. So I would say the way to maybe use the BMC model is to potentially drive some of the capabilities that you have internally. So as you build specific BMC maps, if you like, you can start connecting those to the specific capabilities internally. So if you have, key resources, specific channels and customer segments that you want to address or target, those maybe will be the accumulation of a particular business capability that supports each of those areas. There are a few other ways that that can be used. So for example, if you are trying to connect business capability maps up to the BMC, you might be looking at specific offers that you have, specific innovation parts of the model. And this could also be used as part of the specific buckets within the BMC model as well. So really take a look at the BMC model in terms of the buckets that are in there and see how those potentially could be incorporated into a higher level capability model. And if you want more specific examples of how that can be used, please feel free to reach out. We can give you a demonstration of how that looks in Abacus as well. Yeah, I thought this question might come up to some extent. What are the differences between capabilities, processes, and functions? Certainly, we've been part of discussions before, and this could lead into much more of an in-depth discussion, and we probably could take the whole hour talking about this in terms of theory. And hopefully for today, you've noticed that we use this as a practical guide to capability modeling to try to avoid as much of the theory as possible when we're talking about these things. But certainly there are differences, and from my experience, it feels like most people have slightly different definitions, which I think is okay. I think there's the first thing between capabilities and processes, which is usually a bit easier to define. Capability being what does the organization have the ability to do, and processes much more focused on the how. So capabilities rarely, if ever, talk about how something is done. It's much more what does it have the capability of doing. That's the easiest definition to split. Capabilities and functions, this is probably where it gets a bit more complex. Quite often you'll find capability maps and functional maps are almost a one-to-one mapping in some cases. And sometimes it's worth trying to dive deeper into a capability to understand what it actually means. This depends on how much time you want to spend thinking about those capabilities. So there's a few ways this can be can be thought of. So let's say we have internally, we have the ability to have specific functions, or we've tried to identify a capability called document capture, or we've defined a capability called, I don't know, scan document as a supporting capability. Arguably, they're not capabilities, they are functions. And one of the ways to think about that is the ability to capture a document or to scan the document is itself the function, and the capability would be, let's say, paperless where possible. And the reason for that is paperless where possible as a capability could be made or achieved through specific functions. By having scanned document as some kind of capability, it kind of reduces it too far in the sense that maybe we don't need to scan things, we send things as PDFs. And so the capability is we can reduce paper usage, and it's achieved through functions or technologies such as document capture or scanned document. The kind of original capability from the military of we can get boots on the ground anywhere in the world within 24 hours is a really good way of thinking what a capability is. It doesn't describe how that's done. It depends on the time of day, where in the world, who's actually going to be part of that, the terrain that they're in. All of those things are going to be accompanying that capability itself. And that's one of the best ways of trying to think about those capabilities. I saw another good example of this the other day around how best to define capabilities and functions, which was maybe a bit more niche for photographers out there. But if you have something like a filter on your camera, for example, a neutral density filter, an ND filter for photographers who are out there, the function of that filter is to reduce the light coming into that sensor, but the capability is to allow you to take pictures in bright light. So we have the capability there, which could be then supported by different functions and features. So we have the overall capability that's not going to change, but it could be achieved through different functions and features. Again, hopefully provides some context on capabilities, features, and functions. I would quickly say that whatever capability map you look at is very likely going to break those definitions. And I think that's potentially the world that we've come into here, which is moving from general capabilities to business capabilities. So I wouldn't get too hung up on the definitions. As long as there's a clear understanding internally of what you want to do, that's of course the main benefit here. Another question. So is there a way to capture display in a business user-friendly way, a link to the business strategy to the business capability model? There is, and maybe for context, let's pull this up. So I didn't show this for you earlier on, but in Abacus, one of the ways that we might typically capture some kind of overall business strategy is to look at some of the strategic concepts that we want to capture. So this could be the overall mission of the organization, through to both a business and IT vision, through to the different goals and objectives, down into the capabilities. So that's one way of linking some of those business strategic concepts to a business capability model. So how do those capabilities support the overall goals and objectives of the organization? In some cases, that's one of the best drivers for introducing new capabilities potentially. Let's not introduce something that isn't supporting our overall vision as an organization. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. So those capabilities hopefully are a bit more unique and usually going to be tied to more, I would say, generic business goals and objectives. So that's one way of doing that. There's a few other ways of different notations and models that you can use as well, but building that from a strategic goal or objective perspective into the capability is a good place to start. So there's a few more questions. We've probably got time maybe for one more question. And again, apologies we won't get time to get to everyone, but from all the questions that we've seen coming through, we'll make sure we make a note of those and we can reach out to answer those. But if you do want those answered, specifically, of course, reach out to us so we can set up an Abacus demonstration for you and show you some of the benefits of the tool, alongside some of the requirements you have, which is hopefully what some of these questions are being tailored towards. So let's start with this one quickly, and I think this maybe covers a couple of others. So considering that most of the organizations have in place data-driven business processes, so from data collection, and they're mainly interested in the information that they're managing, so their main asset, instead of the actual capabilities, would it be possible to link capabilities to data through different viewpoints? So yes, I think so far today, we've arguably focused on capabilities being connected to applications, processes, and maybe technologies. But capabilities should be, in my view, connected to most areas within the organization's model. So capabilities can be connected to data sets, and it probably should be connected to data sets. There are quite often times when, for example, there are capabilities that are made up purely from data. So for example, if an organization doesn't have a direct sales capability, so they don't have a direct sales capability internally, it can be made possible not through an application or a technology or a process. It could be made possible through a contract that they have with someone who is selling on their behalf. So you could have these direct sales capabilities being, built of or satisfied through a contract as a piece of data or a data object in Abacus. Again, those different data sets can be tailored. You may have customer information, employee information that are connected to those capabilities. As long as those capabilities are defined in the right way and they're linked to the specific data sets, then that is, of course, going to be beneficial to those areas. So yes, it can be connected to data, and quite often, from a pure data model perspective, that's done quite frequently in Abacus across many of our different customer sites as well. Just a quick final thank you, I guess, to everyone who has joined today. We do these webinars relatively often now on specific use cases within Abacus and EA in general. And of course, it's only through your participation and questions that we can drive some of these webinars and topics. So again, thanks for filling in that poll.